broad context. So, in order from Tara to Stephen to James, we're going to start off by asking, what do you think, just completely ignoring for a second all the technical and design challenges needed to implement it, because it's very hard, I'm aware, just about the idea of games like Dragon Age or Horizon Zero Dawn having an option where you could end a combat session and just move on to the story stuff if that combat session is proving too difficult for you. So, Tara, you can go first.
So I'm actually not against that idea, but I think if you're doing a good job designing your game, it's probably not going to be needed. I think there are other options rather than a skip combat button. So I've worked on several narrative-driven games like The Order 1886 and Bioshock Infinite, and although there are definitely like flavors and fun in the combat, that's not really what either of those games are about. Like, you don't think of the Bioshock series and think, oh yeah, that combat was the strong suit. I mean, let's be honest, the combat in the original Bioshock was pretty terrible, but it's the narrative. But again, like, being able to unlock, like, launch bees at someone was part of the world crafting. So I think that there are probably other options you can use. So aside from the traditional, easy, medium, difficult, and, that stuff, like, I think we should be offering other options to allow the player to adjust it as much as we needed. So, I've worked on games where we've played with the idea of basically like high velocity snap twos or like a snap to center when aiming, but also being able to do stuff like dipping the health of the characters that you're fighting. I think a lot of times there are story elements or environmental elements that are in these combats that we still want to give the player. So although I think, if you're frustrated, you should be able to skip it, I think there are probably other things we can do to let you get these other little hidden gems that we're probably still placing in the combat that are part of the overall narrative. So I think that, like I was saying, that there has to be something. I think that should be a last resort. I think there are probably other things we can do first, but I'm not against doing that. Like, if the options are doing all the stuff I just talked about or having a skip combat, or nothing, like, I would definitely rather take a skip combat button over doing nothing, if that makes sense.
Steve, what are your thoughts?
I don't think that it's necessary to skip combat in most cases, although I do think that for a game like Dragon Age, that having the option that when you engage in combat that you can fast roll the battle and let the AI resolve everything isn't necessarily a bad option. I think that if more games had not necessarily difficulty settings, but story modes where you can become a god character, where you can barely be hurt, or else you have to go AFK and make a sandwich in order to die, you really can get a flavor for the combat as well as for the story, and that also allows a lot of options. What Tara and I and James and those of us in the game accessibility field always advocate for is more options, never less. So for somebody who wants to go through the combat and they want to have that experience like they're there and they're actually fighting, they can do that. And if you're somebody who can't go through it, then I think you should have the same gaming experience just to enjoy the story. And if there's something in the combat, say possible loot drops or possible achievements, you should have some way of achieving those through a means that doesn't necessarily involve getting in the combat. But you can also limit the achievements so that people who are hardcore gamers don't feel slighted by not joining in the combat. There should be a balance between the two.
And James, go for it.
So, on the technical side, because I actually think it is important that we think about the technical side, as Steve was mentioning, it's actually not very hard to enable these modes, because basically all you do is you take whatever AI is running your other characters, and you set the character's health and other stats to something bonkers, and then you have a button that you press to say AI take over, and your character, as they are, will sort of clear out the area, and what abilities, what other things you've given them will change how the combat effectively looks, right? Because the AI will be using those things. Mm-hmm. And so you don't have to necessarily miss all the environmental stuff, all the character building stuff out of the progression system that we've been utilizing. And I mean, I agree that additional options are always of value, because when we think about accessibility, there's just so many vectors and so many different types of people we can make this more accessible for. And when you were talking about this, I mean, honestly, I thought about my folks, right? My mom and dad never going to be able to play Dragon Age, never going to be able to play Bioshock. But this is something they want to share with me, and more importantly, with their grandkids who love video games, who are really excited to talk about them all the time, but they can't share with them because they just don't have the skills. They haven't built this thing. And so if you could have that moment where they could toggle on, hey, let the AI take over because this is something that if I'm controlling it, I'm just going to look towards the ground and spin a bunch. That would allow them access to this world. And I think that for cost, if we were at least doing the quick and dirty have AI take over way, there's not a lot of reason not to have that option somewhere in there.
Great.